Well, I just read from the Gospel of Matthew, the parable of the 10 talents. And the way it ends doesn't sound very encouraging, does it? Weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, oh my. But I think we can find a message in there about encouragement. Now, we are often called as Christians to encourage one another. And as we said in the children's video, you need to have two people to have encouragement. Now, the word comes from the French, encourage, and it means with heart. The word coeur is the word for heart. So when we encourage someone, we are giving from our heart. It is a heart connection. Now, Deborah, as we heard in our Old Testament reading, was a judge in Israel, and she needed to have courage to fulfill that role. She's the only female judge that is named, although there are 4 different prophetesses. Now, she not only renders judgments under her palm tree, she seems to have a good deal of power. She is the one who calls out Barak, the general of the army. And she basically says to him, look around you, can't you see what's happening? We are under the oppression of the Canaanites. It's time you did something about it. And so Barak says that he will go, and that because she has promised that the enemy will be given into his hand. Now, an interesting bit that you don't hear in this scripture is that Barak then said, I will go, but only if you come with me. So we kind of wonder if she was maybe a warrior prophetess. Now, this is part of a cycle that takes place in Judges. In the book of Judges, there's usually someone who dies, then the evil happens, and then God judges, and then the Israelites cry to God, and there is another ruler raised up, a judge or a king, and they defeat their enemies, and eventually they start to take on a lot of the characteristics of their enemies. They start to forget about God and worship the foreign idols. So in a way, they conquer, and yet at the same time, they are conquered. You know, we sometimes do this when we say that we're going to take away money and power from one group because they're corrupt. And then it goes to some other group, and eventually that happens there. So we need to understand that sometimes we become not only what we love, we can become what we hate, because both of them have a claim on us. Now I'm going to tell you a story about this. I don't remember where I heard it, so I'm going to paraphrase it. It's a story about a shining night and a dark night. And the shining knight decides to go in quest and find the dark knight. The dark knight is despicable. The dark knight will take what isn't his, will just do what he wants and not pay his bills, just not a good person. And he's oppressing the people around him. So the shining knight sets out, and along the way he decides to stay at an inn, and he doesn't pay, and he even takes the horse in the inn because his own has become lame. Now he's decided that he has to avoid the roads and go through the forest and go through the mud looking for his opponent. And then one day he sees the dark knight, and he charges at him, and he draws his sword and puts it through the knight and knocks him off his horse. So he goes over to the knight, and he lifts his visor to look at his enemy, and it's empty. And then he goes over to a pond, and he looks in it, and he sees that he has become the dark knight. Now, between love and hate, there is a middle ground. And sometimes that middle ground can take the form of complacency. Now, in the letter that Paul wrote to the Thessalonians, we can see that he's kind of addressing this sort of complacency. They've decided that Jesus is coming back any day now. So what's the point of doing anything in that time? Why build? Why reap the crops? And why bother to do the kindnesses to one another that normally would happen? And so Paul comes and tells them that there is going to be a day of the Lord. Now, the day of the Lord was a common concept to them from their ancient scriptures. You'll find it all through the prophets talking about the day of the Lord. And now they're talking about the day of the Lord to mean Jesus. Now, that day of the Lord is often described in frightening terms, fire, flood, earthquakes. Wait a minute, that sounds like the news, doesn't it? Yeah. Okay, but in this time, there is going to be accountability, but there's also going to be hope. And so they need to cling to that hope and to encourage one another. Now, when we look at the story that we read from Matthew about the master going on the long journey, it's hard to find encouragement in there. But he did entrust his slaves with all of his wealth. And we miss the fact that he gave them an extravagant amount of money. 1 talent was worth 15 years worth of wages. And then the one who received 5 talents then received 75 years worth of wages. The one who received 2 had 30 years worth of wages. Now, the story actually doesn't have a lot to do with the servants. We focus on them, and instead we should be focusing on the master. The master wants to invite them into joy. To the first 2 servants, he says, welcome into the joy of your master. It's the same thing, whether it's 5 talents, 10 talents, it doesn't matter. It's the same reward. Good and faithful servant, you have entered into the joy of your master. Now let's look at the 3rd servant. He didn't see that kind of joy and generosity in his master. What he saw was a cause for fear, distrust, and suspicion. He didn't see the encouragement that was being offered to take this and make something of himself. Now, the end of that reading is that he will be cast out into the outer darkness, where there's gnashing of teeth and weeping. His 1 talent will be taken away and given to someone else. That hardly sounds like the Jesus we know. What does that mean to have the little that you have being taken away from you? Sometimes this is used as a tithing sermon, and I think it's very harsh when we look at it that way. And then we look at the master and call him Jesus, and then what do? We cast him as this really tyrannical figure. So we can only go so far when we start to assign roles to parables. And it takes courage to unbury what we have buried. And we carry things in our hearts that we have buried. And we keep them there because we think that nobody else can see it. Well, actually, we can. And so we need to open our hearts so that the others can be open to their hearts. People carry wounds deep inside them that they think no one else has. And yet the irony is that most of us share the same woundedness. Nobody gets through life unscathed. If you're open in your life, then you are going to get hurt. It's that often. The only way not to get hurt in life is to never interact with anybody. And then what kind of a life is that? I knew a minister who once said when people would come to the church and they would think that it was so wonderful And they were so happy to be there. And she said, good, remember that when someone hurts you, because it happens. But we can't focus on the hurt. We need to move beyond it, and we need to have hope, and we need to have patience. You know, I think of all people, Christians have something to teach the world about patience. We've been waiting 2,000 years for the Messiah to come. And in the meantime, we have carried on as Jesus would have had us do. That takes a lot of patience, and I think we need to offer that to the world that is waiting and waiting for this vaccine that we sometimes think is a magic bullet when it isn't. We still will need to do what we're doing. We will need to have that patience with ourselves to continue doing what we need to do, the masking, the distancing, all the things that we're doing right now here in our sanctuary. We want the world to be turned upside down. And it has been, but we want it right side up. It seems upside down because there have been so many things that have happened. The businesses are closed, the schools, we don't know whether we should open them or not. There's a lot of things that we are frightened of, that we are worried about. And yet we need to know that despite everything, we have survived, our society has survived 2 world wars, a depression, ongoing conflict in Vietnam and in Korea, and social upheaval, the riots that happened. And I mean, and then the recession in our modern times, and we have survived. We have always survived. And so I think when we think about this virus, we need to realize it's just another enemy. It's just another one that we need to overcome, and that we will. Eventually we will, because that's who we are. We're overcomers. That's what human beings are. Now, of course, we do remember those people that we lost in those wars. We just had Remembrance Day, and most of us wore poppies, and we remembered those people that we lost. And you know, the word remember is interesting because it breaks down into remember. So when we remember, we are bringing people back into our community. We are remembering them. Now, I think, although we recognize those as the people of heroes past, it's we need to also remember the heroes that we have right now. We need to remember the heroes that are on the front lines of what we are calling, the people who are doing healthcare, the doctors, the nurses, and people who are driving the trucks to bring us food, and people who work in those stores to make sure that we have food. And yet I don't think that we're going to build any monuments to them. I could be wrong, but I think that we are probably going to remember them in our hearts, and we will need to remember their sacrifices. In that way, we will encourage one another. We will do with our hearts what we need to do to reach out to others. As Jesus did to each one of us, we are called to do to one another. May it be so. Amen. And I think you're going to enjoy the video that we have now, the Celtic woman singing, "You Raised Me Up."